Test, test.
Well, thank you, everybody, for waiting. Thank you to our journalism students for setting all of this up for us. Welcome. Our talk tonight is held in honor of Sig Sinestvedt. He's a former chair of the Brockport History Department. Sinestvedt, served in the U.S. military and the U.S. Navy in the Pacific during World War II. He got his BA and MA on the GI Bill from Michigan State. He taught high school, and then he got his PhD from UPenn. He was the chair of the History Department from 1969 to 1974, and he doubled the size of the department, creating a welcoming, dynamic department culture. He founded the Department of African and African American Studies, and he hired its first faculty. Sig published The White Response to Black Emancipation in 1972, and he taught a course of the same name that attracted large numbers of Brockport students. So our lecturer today comes to us all the way from San Antonio, Texas. Dr. Phyllis Barragan-Getz is an associate professor of history at Texas A&M University, San Antonio. She is an expert on Mexican-American history and women's history. She is also a co-coordinator for the Women and Gender Studies program. Her recent book, entitled Reading, Writing, and Revolution, Escuelitas in the Emergence of a Mexican-American Identity in Texas, has won numerous awards, including the National Association of Chicana and Chicano Studies Award and the National Association for Chicana and Chicano Studies Tejas Focos Nonfiction Book Award. Additionally, she is the 2021 recipient of the Mellon Emerging Faculty Leader, and she is the recipient of the American Council of Learned Societies Project Development Grant. I am very tickled to have Dr. Barragan-Getz here because I think her scholarship is so important to understanding the various ways that women's activism can take shape. So on a macro level, she's writing about women who saw a social need and developed grassroots efforts to solve those needs. But looking more sharply, Barragan-Getz is showing how a group of Mexican heritage women living in the borderlands of Texas utilized their Mexican culture and Spanish language to develop a pedagogy of resistance to the white hegemony of Juan Crow, Texas. Many of you that are in this room today are future educators. We are living right now in a time when the ability to teach students about the struggles of racism and sexism in our nation is getting harder and harder, particularly if you are in a state like Texas or Florida. But don't think that that can't happen here in New York State or that it isn't already, right? And so it's something to be aware of. And the women that Barragan-Getz is going to be teaching us about tonight can perhaps give us some hope and insight into our own battles of resistance. Also, for some of you, the area of South Texas that she's going to be discussing may seem kind of like this exotic, distant land, way down there. But I'd like you to think about, as you listen today, think about this place of Texas as a borderland, an area that after European conquest was a part of Spain, and then a part of independent Mexico, and then for a hot minute was its own nation, and then part of the United States, right? So it's this kind of changing area, right, with geopolitical man-made fluid borders. And we here in Brockport, in northern, central, western New York, are also living in a borderland, right? We live next to a man-made geopolitical border with Canada. Furthermore, if you travel very far in New York State, you're going to travel in and out of sovereign nations, right? You might travel through the Seneca Nation. And of course, the land we stand on today is part of the ancestral lands of the Haudenosaunee, right? So something to think about when you're thinking about these areas of borderland. We kind of live in one here, right? So kind of think about that as she's talking about this space, right? So she's going to give her lecture. Then we're going to have a Q&A session, so be thinking about those questions. For those of you who are online at home, you can just type your questions into the chat. For those of you who are here with us tonight, after lecture and Q&A, we're going to have a reception outside, so please join us for that. And now I'd like to have Dr. Barragan-Getz come to the podium. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Is that better? Like right there, is that better? Thanks. So again, hello, and thank you all so much for being here tonight. I especially want to thank the Brockport History Department, and in particular, Professors Morag Martin and Elizabeth Garner-Masaryk, and to everyone else who was involved in organizing this event this evening, especially Megan McDonald. I'm grateful, I'm excited, and I'm incredibly honored to be here with you all today. So my work focuses on the history of Mexican American education in South Texas. And the center of my work is the history of escuelitas. I will define that momentarily. And one of the things that I didn't necessarily anticipate when I started this research was how much it would reveal that ethnic Mexican women, especially teachers, assumed leadership roles in their communities. So the ethnic Mexican woman teacher, whether she taught in an escuelita or in the public school system, has always been a leader in ethnic Mexican communities, right? She was an intellectual who was committed to education as a vehicle for socioeconomic upward mobility and racial uplift. So what does it mean to be a teacher in the late 19th century to about the World War II era? It meant that you were imparting knowledge and training a younger generation within the confines of a progressive education institution, which means that your work had and continues to have a grassroots dimension that few other professions have. And today I'm going to share with you the work of 4 teachers within the context of Escuelita history: Emilia Davila, Jovita Idar, Maria Renteria, and Jovita Gonzalez. And there are 2 Jovitas, that's right. But first, I want to lay a foundation before we proceed. The first thing I'd like to do is talk about how I define escuelita. So it's a Spanish word that translates to little schools, and it refers to a broad base of community schools that were both informal and formal. So informal escuelitas often took place in someone's living room, usually a woman's, but not exclusively. And this person could open up her home to neighborhood children, and the parents would pay a small fee. And these informal versions often helped to prepare students who were getting ready to enter the first grade. Or they could be like a summer school or after-school program. One of the main characteristics that I have found for these informal escuelitas was that they did not attempt to replace the public school system. They were kind of working around that system. But then there were also more formal escuelitas which did attempt to replace the public school system. These escuelitas did not take place in someone's home. They had their own building. And usually what would happen is members of the community pooled their resources to donate their time, their money, their labor to construct the school and to maintain it. So someone might donate 2,000 bricks, someone else would donate, lumber, someone else land, and then a number of people would donate their labor and their time to actually build it. And these schools operated during the regular school day. So whether they were formal or informal, both types of escuelitas taught children, like they were kind of united in the curriculum. They taught children Spanish literacy, Mexican history, and Mexican cultural traditions, and Spanish was always the language of instruction. And there are a couple of key reasons why I argue escuelitas are significant. First is that they point to Mexican Americans' profound respect for education, and as we go further into the lecture, you'll see why that's such a radical idea. And two, they indicate how Mexican Americans used education, and more specifically these little schools, to negotiate their lives in the United States. So this is a map that plots all the locations of escuelitas for which I found concrete evidence of their existence. So hopefully you really get a sense of how widespread these little schools were, but I also want to add the note that in my research I found several documents that said something to the effect of, these Spanish language schools exist in every corner of South Texas. So I have no doubt that the entire southern portion of the map should be filled with little dots. So escuelitas, they never existed in a vacuum, right? They were always very much impacted by the larger historical developments that occurred in the United States and in Mexico. And for our purposes today, two of the most influential of these developments and what we're going to be talking about were, one, the creation of a public school system, and two, the progressive education movement that framed the school system's ideological foundations. So connecting escuelitas to these historical developments really highlights how these little schools can tell us so much about how ethnic Mexicans negotiated their place in the United States. Because when you have these moments of proliferation where escuelitas are everywhere, that really signals an unfulfilled need. There's something that these communities need that the United States or Texas, society in general, is not providing them, so they have to create it themselves. And likewise, their decline signals their growing irrelevance, right? When these little schools begin to go into decline, that means those needs are being met somewhere else. And also our emphasis here today is that their very existence provided a space for ethnic Mexican women to assert agency, assert independence, and their intellectual prowess within traditionally patriarchal communities. So public schooling in Texas has its origins in the school law of 1854, which created, so in 1854, the Texas state legislature took $2 million to create a permanent school fund that was supposed to subsidize the construction of schoolhouses. But no schools were built with this money. So by 1862, all the money in the fund was either loans, and I use that word because it was never paid back, so I'm using quotes here, was either loaned to the railroad companies or it was given to the Confederacy after the Civil War started. And so as such, public schooling failed to take root until the 1870s, and it didn't actually expand in earnest until the 1880s. So this here is a photo, an example of one of these schools. It was built in 1884 in Mineral Wells, which is about an hour and a half west of Dallas. And so the public school's expanding in the 1880s, and when it is expanding, it structures itself along this notion that there is a single American mind, and that this American mind is white, it's middle or upper class, and it's monolingual English speaking. So progressivism took root in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. The progressive movement tried to bring about social, education, and political reform. And progressives believed, they really did, that if you had an efficient government, then these positive changes were possible. But the progressives, they did all of this with a single-mindedness that was outright discriminatory against poor and working class people of color, because they were so heavily influenced by xenophobic, nativist, and racist ideals. And so all that is to say that at the center of the progressive movement was this rigid belief that cultural and linguistic assimilation from the immigrant masses would provide structure to an American population that was comprised of so many immigrants. Now, these three progressives pictured here on this slide, they illustrate how far-reaching these ideas were, right? Theodore Roosevelt was president from 1901 to 1909. He was a popular public figure long after he left office. He famously said, there's no such thing as a hyphenated American. Emory Bogardus, he was a sociologist at the University of Southern California. He wrote extensively on Americanization for Mexican immigrants. And Annie Webb Blanton was the state superintendent of public instruction in Texas. She was the first woman actually elected to state office in Texas. And she also was another one with this rhetoric, right? That if they're not learning English, if they're not becoming American quickly enough, then they need to be deported. So our next question then is, how does this impact public education in Texas? So the progressive education movement began in Texas, 1884, lasted until about 1940. In 1884, the state legislature passed its first English-only law for public education. So along with these English-only regulations came a standardized curriculum that was unapologetically Anglo-centric and focused on Americanization. And the policy that made all of this possible was segregation. So this was the era of the IQ test and the notion of race-based intelligence. And the scientists, and another word that I use in quotes, the scientists behind these theories positioned ethnic Mexicans on the lowest rung, right? Progressives believed then that Mexican Americans were culturally and intellectually inferior, and according to them, segregation was the solution to all of these issues. Segregation was part of their educational reform policies. So when we talk about progressives as being, reform-minded, segregation was one of their reforms. So what did this progressivism look like? And maybe you all are possibly thinking, how can segregation be considered an education reform policy? So we're gonna have an example here in just a second. Every year, the superintendent of every county had to send his, and I say his because they were always men, had to send his annual account of the school's performance to the state superintendent of public instruction in Austin. These annual statements notated kind of mundane facts like how many desks the school system had, how many buildings, how many students there were. But the last section of these reports was a space where they could write anything they wanted. And I want you to keep in mind that these were official but also private documents. So W.A. Bonnet, he was school superintendent of Maverick County, which is on the Texas-Mexico border. And in his 1899 report, he wrote, about 80% of the children are of Mexican descent and their parents take no interest in educational matters. As a rule, they send their children to school only to keep from taking care of them. So let's break this down. Though the public school system, as I said, beginning in the 1880s, it was expanding, right? In some counties, there were still only like one school every 100 square miles. So when I say the public school system's expanding, it's going from like 6 schools in the entire state to like a school every 100 square miles, which is still progress in the sense that there's more schools, but they're still quite remote. So if you were lucky then, the closest public school was about 10 miles away. And according to Bonnet, this obstacle didn't matter when it came to Mexican children, right? Because if they didn't attend it, even if it was because of issues of distance or poverty, it didn't matter, right? It was really because they just didn't care. And if they did overcome these obstacles, poverty and distance, then they still didn't care, right? They went through that because they wanted the free daycare. And so something to remember is that Bonnet was a progressive, right? This guy was a progressive. He was a progressive in that he was in favor of a public school system that received financial support from the state. And that idea right there was part of reforming education. And his approach was framed by the myth that Mexicans and Mexican Americans don't value education, which is a myth that he both helped create and perpetuate. So, Both African American and Mexican American children were segregated in Texas during this era. Though segregation was the reality for both of these populations, the justification for them was different. Segregation of African Americans was written into the 1876 Texas State Constitution, which stated that there needed to be two public school systems, one for white children and one for black children. It was very clear, the state constitution. Now, Mexican Americans were legally considered white, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if anybody wants to know why or wants to know more about that. But since they were legally considered white, they could not be segregated based on race. That was illegal. But they were segregated across the United States for what school officials claimed were their educational needs. They were segregated in the name of pedagogy. They were segregated in the name of their supposed needs, right? So the pedagogical segregation then served as a cloak for race-based segregation. Part of the argument for pedagogical segregation was that it was in the best interest of all the children. Reasons like, and I'm not making this up, reasons like Mexican children can't speak English, and they don't know what it means to be American, and they're not that smart. And Angloan children won't get behind because they're having to wait for Mexican children to catch up, and Mexican children won't get an inferiority complex because they'll see how much more advanced Anglo children are. But the reality, however, was that no one ever tested these children to assess their English language skills or any of their skills. It was purely based on skin color and their last name. So these ideas about Mexican and Mexican American children gave way to an Americanization curriculum for these segregated schools. And this curriculum was centered on English literacy, vocational and industrial training, and Anglo-centric historical narratives. So George Sanchez, he was a professor at the University of Texas at Austin. And in 1946, he drove across South Texas documenting the condition of segregated schools for ethnic Mexican children. These two photos here are from Mathis, Texas, which is a small town in South Texas. And you can see the photo on the left is a photo of the Mexican Ward School. And this is Sanchez's caption, shows the typical dilapidated, inadequate, rotting old shack. Notice rotting lumber, no screens on windows, no screen doors, improper lighting, no fly-proofing or rat-proofing. Inside it is a dark, crowded, and generally an uninviting appearance. And I will say that this particular school did not have indoor plumbing in 1946. There was a separate outhouse facility that the children had to use. Same town, Mathis. This is the modern Mathis High School with its beautiful architecture, ventilation, lighting system, and well-kept grounds. The school has a total of 10 Latin American students and approximately 120 to 150 Anglo-American students. So just as these progressive superintendents were disparaging ethnic Mexicans' relationship to education, El Colegio Altamirano, which was one of the most well-known escuelitas in Texas, opened sometime in 1895 in Hebronville. And this map, where the red arrow is where Hebronville is located. So in 1895, Duval County, which is where Hebronville was at the time, it comprised over 1,800 square miles of land. And in 1,800 square miles, it only had 18 public schools. All of them were ungraded with the exception of one high school. There was one high school in the entire county. So no doubt motivated by the lack of public schools and the poor quality of those that existed, members of the ethnic Mexican community in Hebronville donated money for the purpose of building their own schoolhouse and hiring a teacher from Mexico. So this is a photo of the students of Colegio Altamirano in 1900. And so the headmaster, Rosendo Barrera, is seated at the center table. Now, he passed away in 1907, and there were several teachers that followed him, but the most influential was a woman named Emilia Davila. So this photo is from 1911, and the teacher is Emilia Davila in this photo. She's the one kind of positioned in front of that chalkboard. She taught at the Escuelita from 1910 to 1916, and then again from 1930 to 1955. And she was about 26 years old in this photo. So she was born in Coahuila in Mexico, and she was a graduate of the Teachers College there. La Prensa, which was a Spanish language newspaper printed in San Antonio, reported that she was, quote, a true intellectual mother of the children of Hebronville. Now, she taught 6 different grades in multiple subjects, all in one room, and the only textbook that she used was a small book of poems, many of which the students studied, memorized, and recited in front of large crowds at school festivals and end-of-the-semester oral exams. So all the exams at the end of the school year were done orally in front of the community. Subjects that she taught were Lengua Nacional, which is Spanish, math, natural science, history, drawing, calligraphy, singing, manual trades, physical exercise, geography, and science. And she gave passionate lectures on Mexican history, lectures on Cortés and the Aztecs, La Malinche and Guatemala, the war for Mexican independence from Spain. Students took their notes and practiced their drawings in composition books that she made herself out of cut-up pieces of paper and then sewed along the edges on her sewing machine. The community provided other teaching materials. So for example, when she was lecturing on the anatomy of the eye, the local butcher donated a cow's eye to the class that she used as part of her lesson. And then, as I said earlier, throughout the school year, she used oral exams to assess students' knowledge and abilities. It became really common for students of Colegio Altamirano to transfer to the public school system once they graduated from the escuelita. The president of the Hebronville Independent School District noted that the students who transferred from this escuelita were, and these are his words, more regular in their attendance, more obedient, and more capable of grasping the English language than those who have not had this training, end quote. So I want to point out that some of what I found and shared about Emilia Davila and El Colegio Altamirano came from historical articles in the Spanish language press and from genealogical research. But most of it came from the personal papers of Rosa Lidia Vasquez. So I met Rosa Lidia in the summer of 2018. I drove down to Hebronville to see the building where Colegio Altamirano was located, because the building still stands. And I met with some members of the board of the Museum Foundation of Hebronville. And while I was there, this one board member in particular kept saying, you have to meet Rosa Lidia. You have to meet Rosa Lidia. She has a collection regarding El Colegio. And so she gave me her number. I called her, and I kind of thought she was going to live on some remote ranch in South Texas or something, but it actually turned out that she lived like a mile from my house. So it was really cool. And Rosa Lidia, she was a second-generation Colegio Altamirano graduate. Both she and her mother went there, and both she and her mother studied with Emilia Davila. And her mother is actually in this photo. She's this the girl on the bottom with the big bows in her hair. So Rosa Lidia attended El Colegio through the 4th grade, and by the time she finished 4th grade, she had already completed algebra. And then she transferred to the public school in Hebronville, where they placed her in the 3rd grade because she didn't speak English. And as she learned the language, she moved through the grades quickly, and then when she graduated high school, she was valedictorian, and her sister was salutatorian. So much of the history of El Colegio's curriculum, of its routine and significance, would have been lost if not for the personal archives of this woman, who died quite suddenly in 2019. So I've been working with the Museum Foundation of Hebronville and the Jim Hogg County Historical Commission. So they redrew the lines of the counties. Hebronville used to be in Duval County, now it's in Jim Hogg County. I've been working with them to get a historical marker for El Colegio installed, and it is going to be installed sometime next year. And Rosa Lidia's personal papers were a significant source. So to all of you students out there, please save your family's histories. So like Hebronville, Laredo also has a long escuelita history, and in the red arrow points to where Laredo is. In September of 1911, the Idar family, a prominent family in Laredo that published their own Spanish language newspaper, they hosted a big conference called El Primer Congreso Mexicanista, or the First Mexican Congress. And they organized the conference to discuss the rampant violence and discrimination against ethnic Mexicans in Texas. Now, during the conference, Texas Mexican women also organized themselves into their own charitable group called La Liga Femenil Mexicanista, the Mexican Women's League. Now, all of these women were teachers. All of these names that you see on this screen, they were all teachers, and their main objective was the education of Texas Mexican children. These women believed that the widespread poverty and illiteracy among their community's children were the most pressing problems for ethnic Mexicans in Laredo. Now, Jovita Idar, you'll see here, was president of La Liga. She was born in Laredo in 1885. Her family organized the first Mexican Congress and published a newspaper called La Crónica, in which she herself published several articles, often under pen names. She earned her teaching certificate in 1903 and taught in a public school in a small rural town for a few years before she moved back to Laredo. Now, as a member of an intellectual family of the city and as president of La Liga, Idar wrote multiple articles on the state of education for Mexican children in Laredo. In August of 1911, she published an article called La Niñez Mexicana in Texas, Mexican Children of Texas, in which she wrote, "We, the parents of our Mexican children in Texas, should unite to cover the costs that a school requires. Mexican children in Texas need education. Neither our government in Mexico nor the United States government can do anything for them. And we have no other recourse than to do it ourselves in exchange for no longer being dismissed by the foreigners that surround us." Idar positioned escuelitas as a solution to the pressing issues for her community, believing that with communal support, these little schools could alleviate the widespread poverty and the tumultuous race relations. Jovita Idar is the 9th woman, by the way, to appear on the Quarter. She's on the Quarter now, as of a few weeks ago, to appear on the Quarter as part of the American Women's Quarter program. Her Quarter, as I said, it just came out a few weeks ago, and the photo of her here in the top corner is the photo that served as the model for her rendering on the coin. So going back here for a moment, you'll see Jovita Idar was president and Maria Renteria was treasurer. So Maria Renteria, she was only 18 in 1911 when she was elected treasurer. She graduated from Mexico City's Normal School for Women, and she advertised her escuelita in La Crónica, stating that she taught women how to read and write in Spanish, and she taught them arts and crafts. But her published writings give us more insight into the possible nature of her curriculum beyond arts and crafts. So 1 month after the founding of La Liga, Renteria shared her research on Mexican women's history with her fellow league members, and then published an article based on her research in La Crónica the following week. Now, her article focused on 2 women who helped Mexico win its independence from Spain. So in her article, she wrote, and I have not been able to find when she passed away, nor have I been able to find a photo of her. But in one article, she wrote, "In studying history, we find beautiful examples of mothers who sacrificed themselves for their children, wives who braved thousands of dangers to save their husbands and enhance their homeland, and daughters who feared nothing and challenged everything to achieve the happiness of their parents and the honor and glory for their country." Renteria's article not only combats stereotypes of Mexican women, but also is an early form of women's history, because it positions women as active agents and acknowledges the value of their labor as mothers, as soldiers, and everything in between. By inserting women's roles into Mexico's founding history during a time when the Mexican Revolution had only recently begun, Renteria was making a statement about the various roles that women could play in their communities, present and future. And by sharing her research with her fellow teachers, she helped all of the women of La Liga understand that by taking on the role of educating Laredo's children in a time when no one else was doing this work, they were carrying out their own revolutionary act. The Mexican Revolution ended in 1920, and afterward, throughout the 1920s, the Mexican consulate exerted much energy in supporting escuelitas throughout the Southwest. Now, to be very clear, they did not have enough money to pay for these schools, so support was usually in the form of books or other materials, but more commonly it was emotional support, right? The consul members attended the little school's holiday celebrations, their end of the year, like semester oral exams. Now, at the same time that the Mexican consulate worked to encourage ethnic Mexicans to maintain their Mexican citizenship and hold on to the Spanish language and to hold on to Mexican cultural traditions, ethnic Mexican men between the ages of 20 and 30 founded multiple civil rights organizations. Now, 3 of these groups merged in February of 1929 in Corpus Christi, Texas, to create the League of United Latin American Citizens, also known as LULAC, which is the most well-known Mexican-American civil rights organization today. So ultimately, these Mexican-American civil rights activists convinced the majority of the Mexican and Mexican-American population to enroll their children in the Texas public school system, to look to the United States as the foundation for their political and civil rights, but also convincing the Mexican consulate to abandon their support of escuelitas in favor of endorsing the push for educational equality within the public school system. So to be clear, escuelitas did not go away completely, but after World War II, you no longer see sources that state they're in every corner of South Texas. La Prensa, the Spanish language paper I referenced earlier, they wrote about escuelitas regularly. And in the late 1920s, their articles begin to lament the fact that so many of these little schools were closing. So there's definitely a connection between the LULACers, the push for school integration, and the decline of escuelitas. And in fact, one of the arguments that I make in my book is that escuelitas had a significant impact on the Mexican-American civil rights movement, which you see coming up with these gentlemen here, right, who formed LULAC in 1929, because so many of these activists, like so many of the men that you see pictured there, they all attended escuelitas when they were young, when they were children. So the last teacher that I want to focus on is Jovita Gonzalez, who was born in Roma, Texas in 1897. If any of you felt the need or feel the need in the future to look her up, it's going to say 1904, but it's wrong. I have proof, it's wrong. It's 1897. So she attended an escuelita on her family's ranch. Her father taught at an escuelita in South Texas. In 1910, she and her family moved to San Antonio, and between 1915 and the mid-1920s, she taught at various public schools in Texas. In the late 1920s, she enrolled at Our Lady of the Lake University in San Antonio, and she took on a job as a Spanish teacher at St. Mary's Hall, which is a very exclusive private school today, but it's co-ed. But in the 20s, it was still exclusive, but it was an all-girls school. And in 1928, she enrolled in the graduate history program at UT Austin, where she earned her master's in history in 1930, in an era when there are not a lot of Mexican-American women earning master's degrees in history. So I found in my research that her work in history, folklore, Spanish, and her experience with escuelitas intersected to shape her approach to pedagogy, right? Because she was a teacher, that was her career for her entire life. And all of this shaped how she taught, how she interacted with her students. In 1929, she was the faculty sponsor for the school's new Spanish club, St. Mary's Hall New Spanish Club. And she collected folk songs from her family's ranch in Roma, as well as from other areas of South Texas, and taught them to her Spanish students at St. Mary's Hall. In April of 1934, John Lomax visited St. Mary's Hall to record Gonzalez and 5 of her students singing the songs that she collected. So this photo up here speaks to her commitment to creating a course of study heavily based on her research that reconciled the escuelita and American educational traditions. By the 1940s, Gonzalez and her husband were living in Corpus Christi. She was active in several different clubs. She gave public talks on her research regularly. In 1943, the Corpus Christi Times, which is one of the big newspapers in Corpus, called her, quote, an expert in Texas history and folklore, a well-known writer and lecturer, and I love this line. They referred to her as a Texas Texan. Now, one of the many projects that she worked on was collaborating with her husband to write 2 series of instructional Spanish language materials for children in the Corpus Christi School District. When Gonzalez and her husband began their Spanish program in Corpus Christi in 1940, it was illegal, it was still illegal to teach Spanish in public schools in Texas. Remember When I said they passed that first English-only law in 1884, it stuck for a long time. So 1940, still illegal to teach Spanish in public schools. The only exception was if you were a school directly on the Texas-Mexico border. The Corpus Christi School District had to receive special approval from the state before the 1940 school year began so that they could teach these classes using Gonzalez's books. But the program was so successful, however, that by March of 1941, the Texas legislature approved a bill that gave any school in Texas the right to institute a Spanish program. Now, the curriculum in these texts pose positive implications for contemporary race relations because, as the texts note, the historical links between Mexicans and Anglos go much further back to their contemporary moment, right, of the 1940s. Goes all the way back to the days of the Spanish explorers because, as Gonzalez argues, Texas Mexicans descend from the Spanish, a population that played a dominating role in Texas history for centuries, for a very long time. And in fact, apparent in all of Gonzalez's work over a period of several decades was the notion that Texas history began with Spain, and that studying the Spanish language required studying the history of Spanish colonization, Spanish arts and culture, and current events in Spanish-speaking countries. And so this is one of the illustrations to one of these instructional books, right? Again, the purpose of the book is to teach children Spanish literacy skills, but all of the paragraphs, all of the writings are very much based on history and culture, and they all have their own illustration. And so this comes from one of their lessons on history. And I need to note here that Gonzalez overlooked the role of indigenous populations, right? Like identifying the origins of Texas history with Spain is kind of, omitting the thousands of years of Native American history in that space. But at the same time, it was still a defiant move because this is an era, even today, right? But especially then is an era where the origins of Texas are with the Alamo, right? And if you try to dislocate the Alamo, then you're wrong. So identifying Spain as that origin story was a defiant move. Now, Gonzalez continued teaching Spanish and Texas history in Corpus Christi until her retirement in the late 1960s. She retired in 1967. And in her almost 50 years as an educator, her pedagogical approach went through multiple transformations. And so what was consistent throughout her almost 50-year career was her commitment to building on the Escuelita curriculum and integrating it into the public school system. And so recovering the experiences and the impact of these teachers provides another entry into uncovering women's political activism in the first half of the 20th century, especially because for a number of years, scholars who have looked at the civil rights and political activism in this era have pointed to the men who founded organizations like LULAC or the American GI Forum. So ultimately, I argue that these women helped create a feminist Escuelita pedagogy that helped them make sense of the violence and oppression that surrounded them, as well as provided an outlet for their revolutionary ideas about gender equality, bilingualism, and education. Thank you. And if anyone has questions. So that's a good question. There's something called the 1790 Naturalization Act, right? Well, you got the microphone now. Does he need to repeat the question? Okay. Okay. So there's something called the 1790 Naturalization Act, which said that to be a naturalized citizen of the United States, you had to be white. And it's not like me and other scholars are reading between the lines or reading against the grain. It's a very blunt act. You have to be Caucasian to be a naturalized citizen of the United States. Now, The US-Mexico War started in 1845 and ended in 1848. So that's taking place, 55 years? No, longer than that. Is 55 years? Quick math. 1790 to 1845. 55 years, right? So it's taking place decades. Let's just say decades. It's taking place decades after the Naturalization Act. But the Naturalization Act is still on the books. So when you have the end of the US-Mexico War, and you have the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which is signed in 1848, the treaty stipulates that the Mexican citizens who are living in the ceded territories, which is basically the entire US Southwest, that they could become US citizens. But since you have that 1790 Naturalization Act on the books, that means that legally they have to be white if they're gonna become naturalized citizens. And it sticks, like to this day. Mexican Americans, when they have to fill out forms, and they're supposed to fill out their race, you have to check white. Either that or you check other, or you just don't check anything, right? Are there any other questions?
Yes, I have a question. What was the effect during the Mexican Revolution?
During the Mexican Revolution, the effect
On the Escalitas?
Oh, yeah. It has a dramatic effect. It has a dramatic effect because about 1 million Mexican citizens leave Mexico and immigrate to the United States as refugees to escape the violence of the revolution. And so not only does their presence in the United States change the composition of the ethnic Mexican population, I mean, I'm speaking about Texas, but you could take this to across the US, right? Even beyond Texas. It not only does that, but a lot of the people who are immigrating are teachers, people who fled Mexico because their schools closed down or because of the violence or the building was destroyed. And a number of them actually open up escuelitas in the United States. So it's like when the Mexican Revolution ends, you have a sharp increase in the number of escuelitas that you see. And then when the Great Depression hits, it goes into decline. And then when World War II hits, an even sharper decline.
Yeah, my question actually builds on your last answer. I was interested, did you see any pattern of tension between Mexicans in Texas who might have been recent immigrants and Mexicans in Texas who kind of maybe identified themselves as native, who had been there for generations?
Oh yeah, big time. Big time, big time. Especially it's complicated by the fact that you have Anglos in positions of power in Texas that don't make any distinction based on citizenship. It's just like they're Mexicans and that's it. And so oftentimes those two groups experience oppression similarly, even though these people are citizens and these people aren't. And so that could, at times, it created tension between them. So yeah, absolutely. And then even when the Mexican Revolution ends in 1920, and you see the Mexican consulate sort of doubling down on their efforts because Mexico wants their million citizens who left, they want them to come back. So they want them to remain close. Then you have the rise of this emerging Mexican-American middle class, right? These 20, 30-something-year-old men who created, the founders of LULAC, essentially, who, they want these people to stay, and they're both sort of fighting for their loyalty. And then to complicate matters even more, the men who founded LULAC make the decision that if you want to be a member of our organization, you have to be a citizen. And so they have resources, like a lot of them are lawyers, right? And if you want to join our organization and you want to be a citizen, we'll help you file the paperwork, we'll help you do that, but you have to do that first. And then LULAC also says English is the national, or not the national, but the official language of our organization. Which is interesting because when you look at the notes, like in the archives of their papers, like minutes of the meetings, they're taken in Spanish. So not everybody's following the rule, but on the books, that's the rule, right? And so it does create, there's a definite tension there.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that. You talked about the Escuelita pedagogy being a feminist pedagogy, and that these men who founded LULAC all went to Escuelita. So it seems kind of like there's a bitterness, right? That they grow up and become lawyers and create this organization that's kind of attacking what they grew up on. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, in a sense, it's like what they're taking away from the Escuelita model is this idea of integration. Like, Escuelitas can be very separatist, right? It's this space, this alternative institution. It functions outside the official public school system, and it's where, you know, this is an era of segregation and rampant racism and discrimination. 1910 to 1920 in particular is known as La Matanza, where the Texas Rangers and anti-Mexican violence, and it's all incredibly intense, right? And there's not a lot of recourse for a lot of these people. So Escuelitas then, in a way, are providing this safe space. And so one of the things that I argue is these Mexican-American activists, right, the LULACers and their whole cohort, they're kind of taking these ideas about we can take our culture and integrate it, and we ourselves should be integrated, not segregated. But you're also hitting on this super important element that's really key to my second book project, which is a biography of Jovita Gonzalez, right, who's pictured it's the portrait in the top row, who, you know, had a master's degree when it was really not common for Mexican Americans, much less Mexican American women, to get a master's degree. I found evidence, and another scholar has also written about this, that she even wanted to get a PhD. She probably would have been the first Mexican American woman to get a PhD. Those doors were closed to her, right? Not a lot of Mexican Americans at all had PhDs in this era, and all of the ones who did were all men, right? And, you know, a lot of scholars who had gone and seeked out her husband when they were senior citizens, when they were studying educational integration movements and LULAC and things like that, interviewed her husband, and no one really pursued an interview with her, right? And she died in 1983, and it's not until the 1990s that there's sort of this renewed interest in her. Yes, thank you all so much.